What do you think about the concept of suggesting a methodology or best practices?
I think it's probably a good idea to have some articulation of practices and rules, because I suspect a lot of investigative work starts in a very haphazard way, and people come together and start working on one long story that, and then get formed into an investigative unit, and tend to follow intuitively a kind of methodology without really stepping back and trying to make it systematic. So it's a useful exercise.
In your experience, have you ever come across challenges in terms of coordinating with other colleagues?
Well, there's the usual ego contest with other journalists and people trying to put their stamp on things or to position the material they collected more prominently. So that's sort of natural in any kind of journalism, and I've been both involved as a writer and as an editor in coordinating sort of large-scale stories involving a lot of writers, researchers. So that's pretty normal, and it's a question of having someone to decide what are the best bits and how it should be arranged and so on. I did have a clash in the case of the investigation I first did into the Balibo killings in Timor for the National Times, where we employed as a researcher on the ground in Lisbon a writer who was very committed to one side of Timorese politics. We knew that, and so I think she was perhaps formed the impression, I don't know why she should have thought it, that she was going to be a co-author, and she was not. Her research was acknowledged, but she had no part in the writing. Anyway, she got very shirty about it, and that's 1979, still going, a feud still going on her part. With the other things I've done, again on Timor and Indonesia, I've been more on my own, really looking for particular sources, and particularly in the intelligence sphere where you keep everything very tight, and even from your editors, there's a lot of trust involved. A thing I did more recently on the old Croatian 6 alleged terrorism case, again that was me over several years getting what I could, using opportunities to grab some fairly widely scattered people, researching archives and so on. So in terms of coordinating, I really don't have a lot of experience in that area.
What did you learn in the cases that you work with other journalists?
Well, I guess the lesson is to make it clear what's expected of them, what their input is, what rights of authorship they have. Usually they know what protections they need and what protections their sources need, and that becomes very evident in the process, but that needs to be very clear. But I think it's more the question of authorship, final authorship, and whose responsibility the final product is. I can see, going back to that Timor story, the first one, that should have been made much more clear. Ideally, if the newspaper had the resources, I should have gone to Lisbon, because I gave the name of a crucial witness to the researcher on the ground. So for her to claim it was, a lot of her original work is stretching it a bit, actually. So, but you can't always do that. It's an expensive business, so you've got to work with people who are where you need them. And I think you've got to be very clear about their agendas and backgrounds and why they want to be involved.
We have the challenge today of communicating in a safe way not only across borders, because here we do it as well through email, but at least you have the option of putting it in the mail or seeing the person and giving the document in hand. But when it's overseas, it's a bit more challenging. Have you come across any of these situations where you are concerned about the safety of documents to be sent overseas? Or
Yeah, I have. There were documents that were leaked to me, one in Jakarta that I kept and waited till I had a safe pair of hands to carry it down to the office in Sydney. There were many times I've kept phone conversations to a very cautious level and tried to avoid using what would be obvious keywords that would pick up in a voice recognition program and trigger some kind of alert. That was especially true in China, where you just would not mention Tiananmen on the phone, or June the 4th, or Falun Gong, or some other obvious words, or even names of leaders could sometimes trigger. The same in emails, you do that. I've been very wary since in Australia in recent years of triggering keyword searches in my own emails. I was listed on one federal police search warrant into leaks of Timor documents in the early, sort of around 2001, 2002. So that made me very wary of, they never actually executed the search on my place, but other people in the warrant, named in the warrant, had their places turned over. So
what was that?
Well, it was a lot of leaks about what Australian intelligence knew about the Indonesian militias in Timor in 1999, and that came out in partly in the Bulletin magazine, John Lyons, and partly on Four Corners, and partly to me, and they had a search warrant out, or a warrant on a particular Australian Army officer, or a couple of them, I think, and then a guy called Philip Dorling, who was then working as a Labour staffer for Laurie Brereton, the Foreign Affairs spokesman. So there were searches in Canberra and here. So people got very nervous then. So you kept phone conversations to a fairly innocent level with any of those people, and if you had something to say to them, you would somehow try to grab them at a face-to-face meeting.
Yes.
When you could arrange it, or think of a plausible reason to ring them up and say where you'd be, kind of thing, and fancy a cup of coffee or something,
Yeah.
So that was something. I think if you're working on Middle East and so on now, you'd be very nervous about setting off some kind of surveillance alert.
And what about how do you know when you can trust a journalist who is overseas?
Well, there are some people who have a long track record in a established publication, so you know what their career record is, and you can make a judgment then. With less experienced people, it's a bit of a trial and error process. When I just started as foreign editor at the Sydney Morning Herald in '97, I was contacted by John Martinkus, who you've probably heard of, he was a young kind of activist journalist who went to Timor on a tourist visa and got around and went out into the bush and watched a lot of Indonesian operations and so on, and would come back to an internet cafe in Delhi or somewhere and send me a stream of just raw notes about what he'd seen. And initially I was thinking, well, this is completely unusual and getting where we don't have any information. It's just not coming through conventional news media at all, or our correspondent in Jakarta. So I was intrigued because it looked interesting and had good stuff. So I eventually, having had a couple of these, I reworked them myself into a conventional news story, because he had no idea how to write news or had no time when he went to an internet cafe. He just got it down and sent it. Anyway, so I spent hours rewriting his emails into news stories and started running them. So they checked out, and I sort of developed a trust in him that he was telling me exactly what he saw and wasn't distorting it, and they were very good, very brave bits of reporting. So that was one.
But you took the risk.
Well, it was a risk for me. There were, others it depends. I mean, often you don't have a budget to hire outside people anyway. So back pre-1998 in the Herald, we did have a big budget. I mean, it was just open slather. You could hire anybody almost. So I had this network of quite wacky people all over the world, and they were fun. And I got to know them, and usually I'd get them to send me a sample or a story, and I'd sort of check it out a bit, but I developed that. It was trial and error, but some of them you just said, no, it's not going to work, and I don't think you're really getting into good stuff. But I had some good, interesting people, but then, the bean counters got in and cut the budgets, and I had to say no more, just use staff reporters or the brands that we paid for anyway, like New York Times and Washington Post and London Telegraph and so on. So that was the way that worked. With the Far Eastern Economic Review, we had a lot of self-nominated amateur journalists all around Asia who were generally honest types, but some of them had blind spots. I mean, there were one or two who had got home loans from that BCCI. Remember there was a big Pakistani, Middle Eastern bank?
When was that?
About 97, 98, it crashed, it collapsed. There was a great story about that bank, but we could not use our own correspondence because in some cases, like a guy in Bangladesh had got a loan from this bank that transformed his personal finances. You know, he could buy a house and so on. So you could not expect him to do a hard-hitting expose of how this bank was splashing money around with people like him to get respectability. Others who part of the establishment, we had a guy in Nepal who was very, very locked into the elite of the kingdom, so you couldn't really expect more than the service events from him. Others who were in very difficult positions, you know, in Thailand, to talk about the monarchy, or Malaysia, we had a Malay correspondent who knew the UMNO power structure very well, but was just constantly getting called a traitor by, you know, her own community for writing about them. Singapore, we had people who risked jail, you know, and torture by the ISD, soft torture, you know.
Is such thing that's soft
torture? What they would call is enhanced interrogation, perhaps, you know, not waterboarding, but the cold treatment and sleep deprivation and all that stuff, you know, which the Brits used in Northern Ireland and Singapore perfected. Doesn't leave a mark, you know. So you developed a feeling for what you could ask of certain people and what you couldn't. And sometimes it was best to bring in an outsider who was willing to be burned in that country and ready to risk being PNG for a while. And I was called into Thailand to do a story on how the Thai military had done a deal with the Burmese to ransack the teak forests of Burma. And I wrote that up because the local guys could not do it. So, and then I went back to Hong Kong and wrote it from there.
And this kind of methodology, what do you think about, like, what's good, what's bad, what's missing, what could you?
So, we're basically talking about a story that is really transnational, involving many countries. Okay, so and you're trying to pull together resources, journalists and investigators in all these countries that, so
how to agree to work together. Basically.
So there's a question of payment and reward. Where does that come in?
Well, when the journalists come from media, it's in the resources agreed. So if they come from established, media, the resources is time.
Their companies.
The company will say, okay, we give you 2 days a week or whatever. When it's not, there are more and more, and I'm talking about my experience in Latin America, of NGOs who do investigative reporting, and they're financed by, Transparency International, Ford Foundation, and all of this. And then there are others, for example, the person I'm going to contact in Uruguay, he has another job and he does this because he wants to do it. So I think it's very diverse situation, and if there's a funding for the investigation, that's even more. You need to have an agreement of who gets what. It has to be a case by case.
All right. I just think you probably need a step with NGOs and organisations, because a lot of them I always think they have a preconceived idea that big pharmaceutical companies are automatically bad, or that transnational mining companies are always wrong, or always exploitative and don't try, or that hydroelectric dams are dangerous, and so
they have an agenda.
They have agendas, so you've got to be clear about their agenda and what input they have, and what the authenticity of the data they're giving you. Of course, they do a lot of courageous work, and people. There's a Brit in Thailand who's just got a 4-year suspended jail sentence for work he did for a Finnish NGO on slave labour. So you've got a lot of respect, but on the other hand, you've got to be aware,
Yes.
as you say, of what they're about, and be willing to balance that, I think, with other steps. And I think there are methods and questions of disclosure, but that would come into this protocol, I think, how much you give away about what you're doing. But that's a preliminary. I think here is the important thing. I think this is probably where you get to the point where you're deciding, is this a story or not?
Yes.
Yeah. And do you go forward or do you drop it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, the idea is that there is moments where we sit down and you don't spend 6 months going something that, continue working in a disorganized way for something that you could have decided in an early stage that it's not a story. Or
What about the point at which you might actually instigate a legal process by supplying information to or exchanging information with an investigative agency like police or corporate ASIC type corporate regulator, or a banking regulator, or a reserve bank, where you might get to the point where journalism reaches a blank wall, and that the only way you can get beyond that would be to develop implicit cooperation with an agency that had the powers to, for example, tap phones, break into emails, call witnesses, seize documents, and so on. And you might develop a working relationship that you would get the first break on what they were doing, or if they decided to prosecute, or in fact it might only be when they lodge something in a court that you would have the legal protection to publish what you found out, that you might otherwise risk tremendous, legal consequences for
like
your
defamation,
or punishing defamation for your company, your employer, or that the individual you're chasing, the people you're chasing, might actually use it to get away, escape somehow, or beat the rap. So because I'm thinking of that age team and the Securrency, the banknote printing scandal with the Reserve Bank.
Yes.
Yeah, that they were sort of working in tandem with investigations.
Okay.
I think. So, I mean, this is just
Maybe
thought
that's no. It's
that
something
it
that need to be.
could come into the mix somehow. That you before you publish even the code of ethics is good that you've got it in early, because I think that's important. That there's a whole question of deception in journalism, which I think, well, I tend to think the MEAA code of ethics here is a bit unrealistic, that you don't, that you've always got to be upfront that you're a journalist and asking questions and so on. I think it doesn't work like that, that a lot of people masquerade as just, say, an ordinary customer of a bank or whatever to get the experience of what ordinary people happen. Or, I mean, there are certain types of deception where you might really mislead somebody and then use them and lose them. It's that can be very nasty. So, but anyway, that's a question that you nut out, that you make clear as you go along. Probably if somebody says, how about if I, pretend to this lady that I'm really keen on her, and that kind of thing, I think you'd say, no, don't go that far, try to involve somebody in a fake financial scheme to see how far that'd go, or I don't know. Or on the other hand, people do, people have gone to celebrities in London with a bag of money and put a camera hidden in the bag to see what they would do. I think the couple of members of the British royal family were.
Okay.
Remember Princess?
No, I don't.
Fergie.
Oh.
She got lured by some newspaper journalist pretending to be oil sheiks from the Gulf or something who wanted her to do something dodgy, and produced a suitcase full of money, and she agreed or something.